This is St. Louis on the Air from St. Louis Public Radio. I'm Elaine Cha.
I think it's a Jimmy John's now.
We got to go over and dance on the Admiral.
And I had this grand idea to head out and find every single one of them.
Little animated elves and...
It was overpriced and your food smelled like the river.
Back then, it was just a blue-collar bar.
Washington, I believe.
Right by the airport.
Just east of Duluth.
I could write a book on how many lost treasures are now this side of a Walgreens.
Today, we're taking a little trip down St. Louis's memory lane and doing so with two guides. The first is a second, that is, the second edition of the book, Lost Treasures of St. Louis. It's a beauty with style and substance. In addition to having a new shape, this version's chock full of new old treasures. That means our guide is one of the people who made the book and its first edition. That's St. Louis author Cameron Collins, who's with us in studio to talk about all things St. Louis treasure. Cameron, welcome back to St. Louis on the Air.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here again.
So Cameron, let's talk about the book and how we've gotten to this second edition. Why write a second edition? I think that the first one did really well, right?
The first edition, I believe, the publisher, I don't think he wants to give me a big head, but I think that the first edition is at least one of the top hardcover bestsellers in their history.
Okay.
And the first edition was reprinted several times, and instead of reprinting it, Josh Stevens at Reedy Press approached me and said, what if we do a new one? Mm-hmm. And it took some convincing.
Okay.
Because it's an extraordinary amount of work to write a book like this. And we had some hiccups along the way. But fortunately, we decided also to bring in a co-author, Dennis Dillon, to help me out. And his input was invaluable.
Okay.
And I'm really happy with the result. It's I've been telling friends and family, it is far superior to the first book in many ways.
So it's almost like a brand new thing.
I think so. There's still a lot of the old treasures. There's lost treasures like the Admiral and the Coral Court. They're going to be in every edition of a book like this. But we were able to go pull out some of the treasures that maybe didn't resonate with a lot of people. And of course, we have plenty of new treasures, unfortunately, that we could document.
Yeah. So you mentioned hiccups. What were some of those along the way?
Sadly, unfortunately, I cared for my mother for the last 5 years. She lived with me in my little house in Lindenwood Park, and she passed away in March of this year.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
And the book was due on June 1st, and so I was very delayed in getting things going, but thanks to Dennis and focus, we got it done.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And there's a dedication that is to your mother, right?
Yes.
And a special piece of archival material. Tell us about that.
This is just simply fascinating to me. First of all, I'm going to say that I love the dedication because I dedicate it to my mother because she always told me that the first edition could have been better.
Okay.
My mother was my biggest critic, but she adored me and she was proud of me. But she would say things like, "I don't like the image for this one. You need to replace that." So, but the remarkable story is, just a few days before the book was to go to print, I was going through some of her old scrapbooks and so forth for memorabilia for her funeral, and I lifted up a tote. And at the bottom of the tote, I found a vintage photograph of the Admiral, probably the most notable lost treasure of all. And as I flipped it over, I was stunned to see that this postcard, it was a postcard of the Admiral, had been sent to her in 1958 by her father. And her father, Roland Irwin Baker, is somebody I've never met. And so the first time I'm seeing his handwriting and I'm seeing him write to his daughter. He was traveling west to find work. And he writes to his daughter that this big fancy boat goes up and down the river, and maybe someday you will dance on its stage. And it just gives me shivers to think 50 years later, 60 years later, she would come to St. Louis and live here.
Yeah. And did she, in fact, get to dance on that boat?
The Admiral was long gone, but I will say she saw it when she visited me in my early years in St. Louis when it was a casino. That's how I remember the Admiral as a casino.
Okay.
And I never even knew about this postcard before that moment. And so right away, I was able to call, and we were able to get it into the book.
Yeah.
And so it's really just another thing that makes it really special.
And really one of those things that maybe your mother would not have even thought to have looked for.
No, she didn't even remember. She was only 14 at the time when she got the postcard. And it's amazing because like the postage is 2 cents but there's the Admiral. And I just love the fact also that my grandfather stopped in St. Louis and walked along the riverfront on his way he eventually settled in Denver and brought his family out. But yeah, it's a lot of feelings going on there.
Yeah. So this book has many editions, over 130 of them.
Yes.
So the Admiral, you said, is one of those that is always going to be there regardless of how many editions come out hereafter. How was it that you and your co-author decided on what would go in and what would have to come out?
Well, it actually was a little easier than it sounds. Really what we wanted to do was improve the overall look and design of the book. And in the first edition, there's quite a few stock images and so forth that, we couldn't find a good photograph for. But also, there were areas of St. Louis that were underrepresented. The one part of St. Louis that I really have never become familiar with is North County and Florissant and Ferguson.
Sure.
But Dennis, being from that area, was able to bring in a whole new list of treasures that, wow, and some great stories. And he's a former sports writer for the Globe Democrat. So he really had some great contributions. And then, of course, since 2017, we've lost some great lost treasures.
Right.
And, like even places like the Eat Right Diner, where I used to maybe have a slinger or two at 3 a.m. after a bar night, or, or Vin de Set, the restaurant that, recently burned down had a fire. And so we were able to add about 130 more new treasures, but we did pull out some that maybe didn't resonate with the first edition and so forth.
And to that point about places that are no longer here, eateries, an ex-user wrote to us about Goody Goody Diner on Natural Bridge just west of Goodfellow. They'd experienced there to an electrical fire in 2019, then it never reopened, and then the building was demolished in 2020.
I didn't even know the building was gone. Wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
So, as far as things that used to be that are no longer there, one of the things that kept popping up is that places that used to exist no longer are there, and they've been replaced by parking lots. So
my joke is I could write a book on how many lost treasures are now the site of a Walgreens, the Parkmore Diner, Redbird Lanes, Carriage Bowl. Well, actually, I think that's now a total access or an urgent care.
Okay.
But in parking lots, sadly.
And, as we're talking about this, there are other places around that are at risk of being turned into parking lots. Is there maybe an example of a place that's gone through a few different versions of, either a business that's been converted to something else that sort of pop up in your mind, whether they're new or old ones from the first edition?
Sure. Several come to mind right away. One that I'm really pleased about is the old YMCA building downtown that has now been converted into a stellar hotel.
A restaurant?
Yeah, and gallery.
Right.
And also it's right next door to the Campbell House Museum where I volunteer. But we also see St. Louis Center. I used to go to a Gold's Gym that was in there after the mall closed.
Okay.
There are examples. Even Eat Right today is now I think a kind of a trendy little restaurant of some sort. Yeah.
I think it's Fleur STL is what it's called.
Yes.
Yeah. We want you to join this conversation. Is there a place from St. Louis's past that you miss or remember fondly? Is there a St. Louis area space that you might even have a photograph of that you'd want to share with us? Give us a call at 314-382-8255. That's 382-TALK. Or you can email us at talk@stlpr.org or hit us up via X at STL on air. I brought up the thing about photographs, Cameron, because you'd mentioned the Campbell House as being a partner, I think, in the acknowledgements, a place where you got some archival material. And then you had said earlier on that you had some stock images that you wanted to replace.
Yes.
What are some of the places where you were able to get better images than what you had initially had?
Sure. A lot of those come from restaurants. Not a lot of people, take photographs of places where they eat, of course, or even imagine movie theaters where they go to find, to see a show. Of course, places like amusement parks and places in sports arenas, like, of course, the Arena and Sportsman's Park, plenty of photos for those. But I always think of, there was a restaurant called The Lettuce Leaf that I could never find a photo for.
Okay.
Nobody's going to take a photo of a salad restaurant.
Right.
And so we had a stock image of a piece of lettuce in the first book. And so Dennis and I both worked to really improve the visual aspect of the book. And finding photographs is extraordinarily difficult because you have to have permission from the original owner or photographer. And Dennis brought a great, one of my favorite stories is we have a Lost Treasure, the Bob Costas benefit. And so Dennis, I said to him, I was like, where are we going to get a photo of this? And he was like, let me work on it and I'll call you back.
Okay.
And so he does. And I'm like, where'd you get it? And he's like, I called Bob Costas. And I was like, what?
Oh, yeah, easy. Oh, my gosh.
Yeah. So he had some connections. And so he's like, called Bob up and said, hey, can we use one of your photos? And he did.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
So before we move on, you mentioned the Arena. Ryan Coleman on X writes, the old Arena is one of the ones that he remembers. And that was the St. Louis Arena by Forest Park that opened in 1929 and closed in 1994. A lot of events took place there. Tell us about that.
Yeah, and that's another one that will, if I were to rank the Lost Treasures, it's going to be up there. And I'll even tell you, when I first moved to St. Louis, I lived in Dogtown, and I remember one day seeing thousands of people file by my apartment to go watch the demolition of the arena. And it was a moving day for a lot of people. But of course, as that gentleman notes, it wasn't just hockey at the arena. It was a site of air shows and garden shows, and Arena Bowl was nearby. And of course, soccer teams played there. So it was a center of St. Louis life for years.
And not just in human form. It hosted livestock shows.
Yes.
Right? In its early days.
Yeah.
And then was the home of the St. Louis Blues from 1967 to 1994. And for a time it was known as the Checker Dome.
Yeah.
What are the Checkers about?
I believe it's due to Purinas. I don't recall off the top of my head, but I believe they owned the Blues for a while. Somebody in the audience may be able to give specifics
Sure,
on that.
corroborate that. So, as far as restaurants go, because that is a place where you said it was hard to get photos, but it's people are going there very frequently,
Yeah.
sometimes for special occasions. We had a note from someone who said that hot tortillas at the Casa Grill, which was the Casa Gallardo grill in the Galleria, is in there. And you mentioned Casa Gallardo in the book. It had multiple locations?
It did, and it was a St. Louis, originated in St. Louis, and expanded from here. But of course, I even remember going to the Galleria location, once again, another example of, there are single instances of restaurants and so forth. But as we see today, St. Louis has been the home of much larger chains such as Panera and so forth.
Right. So another restaurant that has been brought up is fittingly called Yesterday's Bar and Grill in Woodson Terrace. Are you familiar with that one?
That one is new to me. I'm not familiar with that.
Okay, we'll have to do some research into Yesterday's Bar and Grill. Unfortunately, the name is too well suited to what we're talking about.
I'll tell you that when I do events and so forth, there is, without a doubt, always a Q&A session where somebody raises their hand and says, hey, why didn't you put this one in the book? Or do you remember this place? And one of my favorite moments was a woman came up and she said, why isn't Velvet Freeze in the book? And I said, well, there's actually still one open. And she was like, well, you still should have put it in the book. Okay. So you can't win all the time.
Right. Now, we're going to take a very quick break. But before that, I want to take a call from Deborah in St. Louis. And she has something to talk about that we mentioned earlier. Deborah, welcome to St. Louis on the Air.
Well, thank you very much. I'm happy to be talking with you.
Mm-hmm. Yes, go ahead.
And tell you my story. Well, Cameron, I love the story of your mother receiving the postcard from her father.
Thank you.
When he was on the Admiral. And he hoped that someday she would get to dance on the Admiral. Well, as it would happen, when I was a young child in the 1950s, my dance class was one of the many dance classes that got to go over and dance on the Admiral. So I just had to share that with you. I actually did get to dance on the Admiral.
Oh, great.
That is amazing. And thank you for sharing that, because this is something very dear to me. When I started writing the first book, as I mentioned, I knew the Admiral as a casino. And as I moved around St. Louis to interview people, I started hearing stories about what places were like years ago. And the Admiral, of course, just the memories of people dancing and listening to Bob Cuban and going to prom and the fancy restrooms. It makes my memory just, wish that I could have seen that in its heyday. So thank you so much.
Oh, it was a great place, and I had a wonderful time. And if I do come across pictures of me dancing on the Admiral with my classmates that might be in my mother's photo albums, I'll make sure to share them with you, okay?
Thank you so much.
Oh, that's lovely. Thank you so much for calling, Deborah. Well, and to the point about the restrooms or the washrooms, we have Jane calling from St. Louis. Jane, welcome to St. Louis on the Air.
Hi, thanks for having me. And I would say ditto, ditto, ditto to Cameron and Deborah. My father apparently worked on the boat before it was actually finished as the Admiral, when I think it was a cattle barge. And then my brother was just a baby and like the youngest child that had ever been on the Admiral once it became an excursion boat. So I literally grew up on that boat from the time I was a tiny baby in the early 50s. And we also had our dance recitals on the Admiral. I have pictures of all the ladies' powder rooms because that's where our moms took our picture in our costumes before we went out to dance on the, main floor. And it was a great dance floor with Bob Cuban, of course they played. And it was air conditioned and it was huge. And I remember the big lounge chairs and the penny arcade and the calliope. We'd run up to the top and listen to it, especially going under the bridge where it would echo all over. It was just the most magical place. And I cried when it went down the river, when it was sent away. And when it came back as a hull, pretty much, I could smell it. I could actually smell that boat. And I cried again. Oh. I'm crying right now.
Oh. Jane, thank you.
Jane,
thank you.
Thank you. And you and Deborah, I should have interviewed you for the book.
Yeah, well, I'm available.
Jane, thank you so much for calling.
Thank you so much for taking my call.
We're going to take a quick break, but we'll be back very shortly to continue this conversation. This is St. Louis on the Air on St. Louis Public Radio. Welcome back. Let's get right back to the phones. We have Mary calling from St. Louis. Mary, welcome to St. Louis on the Air.
Thank you so much.
Yes, go ahead.
Oh, yeah. I was just inspired to call in when you all were talking about the arena, because when I was growing up in Southern Illinois, we would come as teenagers to the arena to concerts. I heard you mention a lot of uses, but not the concert aspect of it. And my very first concert was Boston at the arena.
Wow.
And
more than a feeling.
Exactly. And I saw Led Zeppelin and the Moody Blues, and it was just an amazing place for that.
Mm-hmm. And did you attend that concert alone, or did you go with other people too?
Oh my goodness, we had a friend with a Volkswagen bus, so we just all piled in and went to the concert.
That's part of the memory as well, right? Like all the people that you went with. Thank you so much. Thanks so much for calling. Yeah. We also have Rich, who's calling from the Bevo neighborhood of St. Louis. Rich, welcome.
Hi, Elaine.
Hello.
Hello, Cameron.
Hi.
Just to confirm, the Checker Dome was named after when Ralston Purina bought the Blues back in the late 70s, early 80s, I believe.
Yes.
Yeah, thank you, Rich.
Yes. And also, I wasn't intending to talk about it, but my dad was a firefighter, and at the arena for many years, the firefighters union would fund its pension program through a rodeo, and they would have some sort of Western TV star as a special guest. And as a firefighter family, we got to go for free.
And you're calling about a watering hole?
Yes. Well, I consider this rather exemplary of the sort of saloons that used to just populate just about every corner in St. Louis. This place was called Thermer's. It was located at Cherokee and Compton, and it was kind of a higgledy-piggledy place. We would call it a dive today, but back then, it was just a blue-collar bar, just like anything else. And it was open well into the 80s, and before long necks became disposable, they would serve beer out of returnable long neck bottles. And whenever I had friends coming to town, we would go there because they were all from the South. They didn't have this sort of thing down there. And I said, this is what, if you watch Archie Bunker's place, this is what it's like in real life.
Rich, I'll tell you, Thermer's is in the first edition, but I hate to say this, but it was pulled because I could never find a good photograph of Thermer's. But I can also tell you, you may know this as well, Thermer's is often considered the very first sports bar in St. Louis.
That very well may be, because North Thermer, he just placarded the walls that wasn't lined with beer cases with pictures of his son's football exploits on the gridirons of St. Mary's.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yep.
And thank you so much for calling, Rich. Cameron, are there other bars that made it in this edition that were not in the first?
Sure. The Way Out Club.
Yes.
Yeah. There, even Dennis said to me at one point, he's like, we got a lot of bars in the book. And it kind of shows my background a little bit. But some others include Shady Jack's, the biker bar that was over on Broadway, Frederick's Music and Lounge, and then even older ones like the Biltmore Club, which is one that Dennis provided to the books. But yeah, I think we cover the bar scene pretty good in the book. So.
We had Bill Stevens write in about Foam Cafe. I spent so many days there speaking with band members, a former diplomat, unhoused St. Louisans, and so many others. I was devastated when they closed. Is that a familiar chorus or refrain that you heard from people about how sad they were when they lost certain places?
Without a doubt. And, I didn't mention it, but even when I saw, dozens, hundreds of people crying when the arena was demolished as well. But really that it goes to show that history comes in many forms. And while somebody may find, a battlefield or or an event to be important, others will, remember, hey, I spent important parts of my life in this structure. I always tell the story about the Top of the Tower restaurant up in North County, and I met a couple who were engaged in that restaurant, and the woman said to me, she said, on our very first date, he proposed with a ring, and she said, do you remember how dark that restaurant was? And I said, well, I haven't been there. And she's like, well, it was so dark. I didn't say yes until I went outside and can make sure that the ring was real.
Oh, gosh.
So, that's where memories are created. And just like people called in to talk about dancing on the Admiral. But Foam, I remember going down to Foam and having a beer and reading a book or go to an event. It was a great little space.
Speaking of restaurants, another one that was at the top was a revolving restaurant at the top of the Millennium Hotel. Is that restaurant in the book?
The hotel is in the book.
Okay.
So the hotel is there, and of course the Millennium, I believe, still stands empty on the riverfront. But yes, I do, and I even recall being in the rotating restaurant myself. So
yeah,
that's one I remember.
So are there many places that do, if they've not been replaced by parking lots, that stand empty and maybe waiting for the next thing to happen?
Sure. How about the Railway Exchange Building where Famous-Barr was? Still, I think it's in some sort of stage of being renovated. The Jefferson Hotel, which was built for the World's Fair. I think that may be in the same category. St. Louis does, reuse its structures. They also tear things down too quickly. But many will go through several iterations.
Yeah. Maggie May on X wrote about a very specific thing at Famous-Barr on that topic. She wrote Famous-Barr French onion soup. So it was among several downtown St. Louis department stores, sometimes called Famous and Barr. The store became a division of Macy's in the early 2000s, but finally closed in 2013. And that was in the Railway Exchange Building downtown that you were just talking about. What about that French onion soup, though?
Yeah, and this is one that is discussed prominently in the book. In Famous-Barr, in the big three downtown, Stixbury and Fuller, Scruggs, Vandervoort, and Barney, they play big roles in the book. They're amazing memories for people, going to Miss Hulling's cafeteria after a day at Famous-Barr, riding the escalators, checking out the Christmas displays, and we still have department stores out in the county and so forth, but the time of going downtown and seeing if Famous-Barr's displays were better than Scruggs. Those days are kind of in the past now.
Yeah, they are.
Yeah.
Robert is calling from Troy, Missouri. Robert, you're on St. Louis on the Air.
Oh, thank you so much.
Sure, go ahead.
Oh, I was thinking about I was brought up in Berkeley, the little township of Springdale, right by the airport. There used to be an amusement park there called Holiday Hill.
Yep.
And there's still an old cemetery there. It's a black cemetery, and we're doing work there and trying to clean up all the brush and stuff. It's just overgrown, but that was a great place to live back then. They had Ace's Stables down there, and they had where 170 is. They had a bridle path that they would take their horses and go up, and of course we'd ride our motorcycles on it too. And it was just a fun place to live as a kid.
I love hearing that. And also, let me chime in and add, one of my favorite contributions from Dennis was the Carrollton neighborhood, which was also...
Yes. I had friends that lived there, and all my half-sisters and stepsisters, they swam in the swim meets there at Carrollton and Paddock, and it was a great time.
Yeah. And Carrollton, actually in the book, I have a photograph of... I trespassed to get in there, but you can actually still go and see the roads and the driveways.
Yeah, and the old pool's still falling apart there. But it was a great pool, and they had a little country club. It was very affluent, too. It was a nice neighborhood.
Yep.
Thank you, Robert, calling from Troy, Missouri. Let's now go to Jerry, calling from O'Fallon, Missouri. Jerry, please go ahead.
One of our main hangouts like 40 years ago was a place called Powers on Central Avenue, I guess just north of Forsyth. And across, I think it's a Jimmy John's now. And just north across the alley, it was a place called CUNY's, which is now John P. Fields. And it's kind of a nice, much nicer, upgraded atmosphere. But at that time, I mean, they literally had like a wooden screen door. It was like a small saloon or tavern you'd see in some small town somewhere. And we used to say, because it's right, a block away from the courthouse, that probably a lot more cases got solved there than actually in the courthouse.
We're going to take a very quick break here. We'll be back in just a minute. This is St. Louis on the Air on St. Louis Public Radio. Welcome back. Before we get too far, I want to ask about the mileage that you covered. So for this new edition of the book, I understand you drove 600 miles around the region, and that was all in one day.
Correct.
What was that all about?
So I had a germ of an idea come up, and it was not too long before the book was to go to print. And sadly, many of listeners will know about the St. Louis parish closings this summer. 35 were closed and 15 were merged. And I had this grand idea to head out and find every single one of them and photograph them in a new feature for the book. I had no idea how big the St. Louis Archdiocese is. And I found myself traveling down to St. Genevieve County, Jefferson County, North County. When I finally arrived back at my house at later than 11 o'clock at night, I had driven more than 600 miles, and I still hadn't gotten to the city parishes. Wow. So I still had to go out the next day and get the rest of them. And it was actually quite a stressful day. When I suddenly started to realize how much work was ahead of me, and in some of the places I went, I didn't have cell reception, so I was getting lost. Yeah. And But I'm really happy with it turned out. So every one of those parishes has a photograph in this feature of the book.
Yes.
And I will even share that in a rural part of the state, I made the mistake of turning around in somebody's driveway. And I was confronted by an angry individual who, fortunately, I was allowed to talk myself out of the problem.
Okay.
It was a little wild.
So you were doing God's work, and you had Godspeed with you.
It helped when I finally explained I was looking for a church.
Right, right. Jim is calling from St. Louis. Jim, welcome to St. Louis on the Air.
Yeah, good afternoon. I used to work downtown in the early 80s at the famous old Famous-Barr building, and just wanted to say the windows, Christmas windows on that building were legend at the time. But referencing an old restaurant just down on 11th and Pine or in that area, it was the old O.T. Hodges, which was just a famous place to rub elbows with everybody from three-piece suitors down to indigents who they sometimes hired for busboys, and it was just an amazing kind of old memory that I had.
And Jim, that is one that's in both editions of the book.
Yes.
Yep.
Thank you, Jim.
Prominent place.
Let's now go to Nina, who's calling from Kirkwood. Nina, welcome.
Hi, thank you. One of my fondest Christmas memories was my parents taking all of us kids down to walk around on the streets of St. Louis, downtown St. Louis, and look in the windows at Sticks and Famous. They were absolutely beautiful and charming, full of little animated elves and trees. It was just adorable. And then we would go up to, might have been the 8th floor, and go through Santa Land, just among my greatest childhood memories. That was in the 60s, maybe even into the early 70s. And then Boyd's, across the street in the basement, had the monorail.
Yep.
And we didn't get to ride the monorail every year because it was expensive, at least for us. But I do remember riding it at least once. It was only for little kids. You'd walk up on a platform, and it was hanging on the ceiling in the basement at Boyd's basement. So those are my greatest Christmas childhood memories.
Nina, thank you.
Thank you.
And we also have Leslie, who is calling from Kirkwood as well. Leslie, welcome.
Thanks so much. Yeah, my husband and I started dating in the early 90s, and we lived way out in the exurbs of Wildwood, and we would travel to St. Louis for this cool little coffee shop that I think was called the Del Mar Triangle Cafe, but it was just east of the Loop, and it was just a kind of a really cool, funky, a little bit shabby place that had books and games and just felt like a cozy living room, and we really missed it when it was closed down, and now the building's not there.
Oh, I wish that sounds like my kind of place. I wish, I apologize, I don't know about that, but that sounds like a place I would have enjoyed.
Yeah, that was the Del Mar Triangle Cafe. Thank you so much, Leslie, for calling. We also have from Sketchy City on X, who writes about Coffee Cartel, which I remember. That was in the Central West End. And then we have Christy from St. Louis County on the line. Christy, welcome.
Hi. I just wanted to mention the St. Louis Public High School Stadium, if it hasn't already been talked about. It was a stadium that all of the high schools would participate in on Saturday football games. Sometimes they would do 2 or 3. And then at the end of the season, there were championship games where there was a parade within the stadium of all the high schools and their bands. I was a little young, but I had cousins who participated, so I got a chance to go there. It's been gone for quite some time, but it was a really wonderful gathering place as I think back for kids all over St. Louis City.
And Christy, what are some of your best memories from that place?
Well, they're very vague. It was on Kings Highway near St. Louis Avenue. And it was just a big deal event. You'd hear all these bands. It was kind of like the Super Bowl of football for St. Louis high school students.
Christy, thank you so much for calling. It is in the book.
It is. It's in both editions. That's one I think I would keep in there.
Why is that?
That's just a special place for people with a lot of memories, and also a perfect example of one where we found a much better photo for the second edition.
Oh, great! And where did that photo come from?
It may have been the Missouri History Museum. They were a huge contributor to the book and a big, massive help.
Yeah. We also have Steve calling from St. Louis. Steve, welcome to St. Louis on the Air.
Hello, thank you for having me on. One of my fond memories from the early 80s was toward the end of the disco era, was a nightclub for under 21-year-olds called Animal House.
Oh.
And that's where everybody would go to enjoy disco music when you weren't old enough to drink. And they had non-alcoholic beverages for everybody. And it was just a fun time for all the kids in the St. Louis area to gather.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Steve, for sharing that. We've talked about clubs for people who are younger, so it's great to hear about that one. We also have Susan, who is calling from University City. Susan, please go ahead.
Hi. Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yes. Go ahead.
Oh, I was calling about the Beaumont building, which was on Washington, I believe, right near Grand. My father had an office there. He was a surgeon, and I was away from St. Louis for about 25 years. When I returned, the Beaumont building had disappeared. And I believe the Pulitzer, or I'm not sure what, was in its place. It made me very sad. It was a beautiful building. And is it in your book or what? And also around the corner was Pope's Cafeteria, where we would go, and Woolworths and Garavelli's, which was a wonderful place to eat. So can you tell me a little about what happened to the Beaumont building?
And Susan, thank you.
Thank you. And I will say, however, all the other places you mentioned, Pope's and Garavelli's, they're in the book. But Beaumont is not. I apologize. We do have an architecture section, but limited space, and that's one that I'll have to look into. But unfortunately, I do not know the reason or why it was demolished.
Mm-hmm. We have another user on X who is talking about Riverboat McDonald's, also known as the floating McDonald's. And our executive producer was talking about being on that boat as a child and getting the scent of the river along with the meal.
So that's exactly when I would, and of course the floating McDonald's is in both books. However, every time I mention that in an event, somebody will say, "I loved the floating McDonald's," and somebody else will say, "It was overpriced and your food smelled like the river." So, lost treasures bring various opinions. So,
right.
But you can't deny it was a better time for our riverfront back then. We even had a floating Burger King for a while.
Oh, okay.
And that's just one of my things. I wish we still had boats and excursion boats and things like that on the riverfront.
We're going to take one more call from James, who is in Belle Noire. James, welcome to St. Louis on the Air.
Thank you. Trio Restaurant used to set down at Brown Road and Natural Bridge, and it went all the way across that island area. And my mom used to work there.
Oh.
What was the name of it again, sir?
Trio Restaurant.
I'm not familiar with that one. I apologize. Maybe I'll have to start digging into version 3.
It goes back a ways. I was a child when my mom worked there. Also, Cicero's Restaurant.
Of course.
Yes.
Which was right around the corner from the Wedge Cafe.
Yep, and that is in the book.
And Ace Stables is still at Natural Bridge and 170.
Thank you so much for calling, James. One of the things that I wanted to make sure I asked you, you moved here in the 90s.
Mm-hmm.
So there are lots of places that you learned about that you did not have firsthand knowledge of. You'd never seen them.
The vast majority, I would say. Yeah.
And, this hour has just flown by. Is there anything that you had a personal relationship with over the time that you've lived here that is in this book, that you have really fond memories of yourself?
Wow, that's a question I have not really considered. I think when I wrote the book, I didn't want to put a whole lot of Cameron in there. I wanted to focus on people who actually lived here and so forth. But definitely there are places, and people have asked me, what if you could go back in time, what are the treasures you'd want to see? And I say things like, I would have loved to try a Falstaff beer or to meet Phil the gorilla. I'm a big animal lover, so the animals in the zoo, like Miss Jim and so forth, were very special to read about and learn about, even if I didn't see them in person.
Mm-hmm. So you do have a number of upcoming events. We'll put a list of those on our website. But what are some of the ones that are coming up?
So currently, Wednesday, I will be at Ladue Pharmacy signing books. And then on the 10th and the 17th, I'll be signing books at the City Foundry holiday pop-up. And Dennis has an event at Oasis coming up. I believe that's also Wednesday.
Okay.
And in terms of events where we will do presentations, we're still booking, and I will get those to you as well. And those are where we actually do a slideshow and tell a lot of the zany stories that I've touched on a little bit here today.
Right. As you drive around and you look at places, do you ever think about what is at risk of becoming a lost treasure?
Constantly.
Yeah.
St. Louis is such a unique city. It's one of the most historically significant cities in American history, and I talk about that in the book as well. It's just a very, there are a lot of places here that are in danger of disappearing, and some of them are on purpose, and some of them are not. So, but there's a lot of great organizations in the city working to keep, things around.
Yeah.
So, and I appreciate them.
In this last minute or so, the dedication again is to your mother. In terms of the responses that you've gotten to this second edition, is there one that stands out that you think would really please your mom?
Wow, that's a great question. I think Mom would just be proud of the fact that I am an author in a city that I was not born in, and I kind of and she's just was always so supportive of me. And sometimes I would take her, like there's some friends I have up at Bellefontaine Cemetery that they are huge in the history scene of St. Louis, and they've met her, and they always bring her up and say, your mother was such a wonderful person, and she never kept quiet.
Yeah.
And she's a big part of it.
Cameron Collins is co-author with Dennis Dillon of the second edition of Lost Treasures of St. Louis. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
This episode was produced by Elaine Shaw,
with our executive producer, Alex Hoyer.
Our audio engineer is Aaron Dorn. This podcast was mixed and edited by Aaron.
St. Louis on the Air is a production of St. Louis Public Radio. Understanding starts here.
St. Louis on the Air proudly supports local artists by using music from Life Creative Group.
Do you find yourself regularly listening to episodes of St. Louis on the Air? Suggest us to a friend you think might enjoy our conversations. And leave us a review and rating on Apple Podcasts on the App Store. It's the simplest way to help people discover our show. Thanks.
St. Louis Public Radio is a member-supported service of the University of Missouri St. Louis.
The Gateway brings you the day's news each weekday from around the St. Louis region and the state capitals in Jefferson City.
Our schools are accredited. We don't need this bill.
And Springfield.
How many more years must pass before lawmakers see time is of the essence?
I'm Abby Larico. Join me each weekday for The Gateway on the STLPR app or wherever you get podcasts.